Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Introduction. The complete history of South Africa. South Africa's history is a story of ancient civilizations, colonial conquest, racial segregation, and a hard-fought journey to democracy. This land has witnessed the rise and fall of powerful kingdoms, the arrival of European settlers, brutal conflicts, and one of the most famous freedom struggles in modern history. But how did a land of ancient tribes, European settlers, and fierce struggles become the diverse nation we see today? In this documentary, we'll explore South Africa's complete history, from the early hunter-gatherers of the region to the mighty Zulu and Xhosa kingdoms, the Dutch and British colonial rule, the dark era of apartheid, and the inspiring fight for freedom that led to modern South Africa. Stay tuned as we uncover the pivotal moments, key figures, and untold stories that shaped this nation. Let's begin. Early civilizations and indigenous peoples. South Africa's history begins thousands of years ago with its earliest known inhabitants, the San and Khoisan peoples. These groups, collectively known as the Khoisan, were among the first to walk this land, shaping its early history long before European contact. The San and Khoisan, the first South Africans, the San, often called Bushmen, were expert hunter-gatherers, surviving in some of the world's harshest landscapes. They left behind intricate rock paintings, some over 25,000 years old, that provide glimpses into their spiritual beliefs, hunting techniques, and way of life. The Khoisan, on the other hand, were pastoralists, domesticating cattle and sheep. Unlike the nomadic San, the Khoisan established more permanent settlements and engaged in early trade networks. When European settlers arrived centuries later, it was the Khoisan who first made contact, forever altering the region's history. The Bantu migrations, a new era, 3rd–13th century CE. Between the 3rd and 13th centuries CE, waves of Bantu-speaking peoples migrated southward from Central and West Africa. These migrations reshaped the cultural and political landscape of South Africa. The Bantu brought with them ironworking, advanced farming techniques, and cattle herding, allowing them to establish larger and more complex societies compared to the indigenous Khoisan groups. Over time, the Bantu formed powerful chiefdoms and early tribal societies, some of which would become the most influential kingdoms in African history. The rise of the Zulu and Xhosa peoples, among the many Bantu-speaking groups, two would emerge as dominant forces: the Xhosa, who settled in the Eastern Cape and developed a structured society based on clan leadership and cattle wealth. The Zulu, who, under leaders like Shaka Zulu, would later forge one of the most formidable African military states. By the time European settlers arrived, South Africa was already a land of deeply rooted cultures, thriving trade networks, and powerful kingdoms. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic historical transformations in Africa's history, one that would lead to centuries of conquest, resistance, and change. But what happened when the first European ships arrived on South Africa's shores? In the next chapter, we'll explore the age of exploration, the Dutch and British colonization, and the conflicts that followed. Stay with us as we uncover South Africa's complex past. Chapter 2: European colonization. As European explorers set their sights on new trade routes and territories, South Africa became a crucial stop on the maritime route to Asia. This chapter delves into the European colonization of South Africa, from early Portuguese exploration to Dutch settlement and British occupation, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and cultural transformation. Bartolomeu Dias and the first European contact. The first European known to set eyes on South Africa's shores was Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias in 1488. He became the first European to round the Cape of Good Hope, proving that a sea route to the Indian Ocean was possible. However, the Portuguese did not settle in South Africa, focusing instead on India and the spice trade. For over a century, South Africa remained largely untouched by European colonization until the arrival of the Dutch in 1652. 1652. The Dutch established the Cape Colony in 1652. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, one of the most powerful trading companies in history, established a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope to supply fresh food and water to Dutch ships traveling to and from Asia. The man responsible for setting up this station was Jan van Riebeeck, and this marked the beginning of European settlement in South Africa. What started as a simple resupply station soon expanded into a full-fledged colony. Dutch settlers, known as Boers, meaning farmers, were granted land, and enslaved laborers from Africa and Asia were imported to work on Dutch farms. Conflicts with the indigenous Khoisan. Dutch settlements expanded. Tensions with the indigenous Khoisan people escalated. The Khoisan, who had been the dominant pastoralists of the region, were pushed off their grazing lands and forced into servitude or conflict with the Dutch. This led to wars and displacement, permanently altering the power balance in the region. By the late 1700s, the Cape Colony had grown into a diverse society of Dutch settlers, enslaved people from Asia and Africa, and indigenous groups struggling to resist European encroachment. But South Africa's colonial story was far from over. New imperial powers had their eyes on the Cape. British occupation, a new colonial power arrives. In 1795, the British seized control of the Cape Colony from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars. Although they briefly returned it to the Dutch, Britain reoccupied the Cape permanently in 1806. The British introduced significant changes, including abolition of the slave trade, 1807, which angered many Dutch settlers who relied on enslaved labor. English as the official language, replacing Dutch. Encouragement of British settlement, further shifting the power dynamics in the region. The arrival of the British set the stage for tensions between British rulers and Dutch-descended Boers, who felt their way of life was under threat. This growing divide would lead to one of the most defining migrations in South African history, the Great Trek. The Great Trek, 1835-1840s. The Boer Migration. Feeling increasingly marginalized under British rule, thousands of Boers, Afrikaners, decided to leave the Cape and migrate inland in search of independence. This mass migration, known as the Great Trek, saw thousands of Boer families, Voortrekkers, traveling into the interior of South Africa in ox-drawn wagons. But the land they sought to settle was not empty. African kingdoms, including the Zulu, already controlled vast territories. This led to conflicts with the Xhosa and Zulu as Boers claimed land. The Battle of Blood River, 1838, where Boer forces clashed with the mighty Zulu Kingdom under King Dingaan. The establishment of Boer republics, including the Natalia Republic, the Orange Free State, and the South African Republic, Transvaal. The Great Trek reshaped South Africa's demographics, setting the stage for future conflicts between the Boers, African kingdoms, and the British. What's next? The road to war and colonization. Intensifies by the mid-19th century, South Africa was a land of competing powers, the British in the Cape, the Boers in the interior, and African kingdoms fighting to retain their lands. But a discovery in the IZUB. Late 1800s would change everything, the discovery of gold and diamonds. The fight for control over South Africa's vast wealth would ignite wars, revolutions, and the eventual formation of modern South Africa. Stay tuned as we explore the rise of the Zulu Empire, the Anglo-Zulu War, the Anglo-Boer Wars, and the brutal struggle for dominance in South Africa. Rise of African kingdoms and conflicts as European settlers expanded their control over South Africa. Indigenous African kingdoms were not passive bystanders. They fiercely resisted colonization, waging wars to protect their land, cultures, and way of life. Among these kingdoms, one stood out as the most formidable force, the Zulu Kingdom under Shaka Zulu. This chapter explores the rise of powerful African states, their conflicts with European settlers, and the major wars that shaped South Africa's destiny. The rise of the Zulu Kingdom under Shaka Zulu, 1816-1828. In the early 19th century, Shaka Zulu, one of the most legendary military leaders in African history, transformed the Zulu chiefdom into a dominant kingdom, Shaka's military. Innovations: the buffalo horn battle formation. Shaka restructured his army to attack in a three-pronged strategy. The horns flanked the enemy. The chest engaged in frontal assault. The loins remained in reserve, ready to reinforce. The short stabbing spear, Ikolwa. Unlike traditional throwing spears, this weapon was used in close combat, making Zulu warriors more deadly in battle. Intensive military training. Shaka trained his warriors to run long distances barefoot, making them one of the most mobile and disciplined forces in Africa. Through brutal but effective leadership, Shaka expanded the Zulu Kingdom, conquering neighboring tribes in a period known as the Mfecane, the crushing. This era saw widespread warfare, migration, and political upheaval across southern Africa, as smaller chiefdoms were either absorbed or destroyed by the rising Zulu power. But the Zulu were not the only indigenous people resisting colonization. The Xhosa, another powerful African nation, would spend a century fighting against British expansion. The Xhosa Wars, 1779–1879, a century of resistance. The Xhosa Wars, also known as the Frontier Wars, were a series of conflicts between the Xhosa people and European settlers, primarily the British. As British forces expanded eastward from the Cape Colony, they encroached on Xhosa lands, leading to nearly 100 years of warfare. Key events in the Xhosa Wars, 1779–1819, early conflicts with Dutch and British settlers over land and cattle. 1834–1836, the British launched an invasion into Xhosa territory, marking a shift to large-scale warfare. 1856–1857, the Xhosa cattle killing movement. A tragic and desperate prophecy led the Xhosa to slaughter their own cattle, believing it would drive the British away. Instead, it led to widespread famine, weakening Xhosa resistance. 1879, British forces finally overpowered the Xhosa, fully incorporating their lands into the Cape Colony. Despite their resilience, the Xhosa, like many other African groups, were ultimately defeated by the superior military technology of the British. But one of the most dramatic conflicts in South African history was still to come: the Anglo-Zulu War. The Anglo-Zulu War, 1879. The battle that shook the British Empire. By the late 19th century, the British sought to crush Zulu independence and fully integrate Zululand into their colonial empire. In 1879, they launched an invasion of Zulu territory, expecting an easy victory. However, they underestimated the strength and strategy of the Zulu army. The Battle of Isandlwana, January 22, 1879, a stunning Zulu victory. A force of 20,000 Dalwars. Zulu warriors ambushed and completely overwhelmed 1,800 British troops, marking one of the worst defeats in British colonial history. British soldiers, armed with rifles and cannons, were outmaneuvered by the disciplined Zulu warriors fighting with spears and shields. This battle shattered the myth of British invincibility and remains one of the most famous African military victories of the 19th century. The Battle of Rorke's Drift, January 20–23, 1879, British redemption. On the same day as the disaster at Isandlwana, a small British garrison of 150 men at Rorke's Drift successfully held off 4,000 Zulu warriors in a desperate last-stand battle. The defenders, fighting from behind makeshift barricades, managed to repel the Zulu assaults, becoming legendary, heroes in British history. The fall of Zululand. Despite their early victory at Isandlwana, the Zulu could not withstand the full military might of the British Empire. By July 1879, the British had regrouped, invaded Zululand again, and crushed the Zulu forces at the Battle of Ulundi, marking the end of the Zulu Kingdom's independence. Shaka's once mighty empire was now under British rule. The legacy of these conflicts. By the late 19th century, most of South Africa's powerful indigenous kingdoms had been defeated, annexed, or weakened by European colonization. The battles of the Zulu and Xhosa had delayed British dominance, but they could not stop the inevitable tide of colonization. However, a new struggle was about to begin. As the British tightened their grip on South Africa, they would soon find themselves fighting a new enemy, the Boer settlers. The discovery of gold and diamonds would fuel another brutal conflict: the Anglo-Boer Wars. What happens when unimaginable wealth is discovered in a colonized land? Who will claim power, the British or the Boers? Stay tuned as we dive into one of the most defining conflicts in South African history: the fight for control over South Africa's vast riches. The discovery of gold and diamonds. By the mid-19th century, South Africa was a land divided. British forces controlled the Cape and Natal, The Boers had established independent republics, and African kingdoms were fighting to retain their lands. But a discovery in the late 1800s would change everything. The unearthing of diamonds and gold would transform South Africa from a sparsely populated frontier into one of the world's wealthiest and most contested territories, fueling economic growth, political conflict, and ultimately, war. 67. Diamonds discovered in Kimberley, a new era of wealth, begins. In 1867, a young boy named Erasmus Jacobs found a shiny stone near the Orange River. This stone turned out to be a diamond, and soon more were found in the region around Kimberley. The diamond rush begins. By the early 1870s, thousands of prospectors flooded Kimberley, hoping to strike it rich. But unlike previous gold rushes in California or Australia, the mining industry in South Africa quickly became highly organized and controlled by powerful businessmen. The most influential figure to emerge was Cecil Rhodes, a British entrepreneur, who founded De Beers Consolidated Mines in 1888. Rhodes would go on to dominate the diamond industry, amassing a fortune and expanding British influence across Africa. 86. The Gold Rush, the birth of Johannesburg. If diamonds brought fortune, gold brought empires. In 1886, prospectors discovered vast gold deposits in Witwatersrand, an area that would later become Johannesburg. This was one of the richest gold finds in history, attracting thousands of miners, adventurers, and fortune seekers. British investors looking to control the mines. Tensions between the Boers, Afrikaners, who controlled the land, and the British, who wanted the gold. With the sudden influx of wealth, Johannesburg transformed from a dusty mining camp into the largest and most industrialized city in Africa within just a few years. British-Boer rivalry intensifies. The massive gold and diamond wealth shifted the balance of power in South Africa. The Boers, who had established the South African Republic, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, controlled much of the gold-rich land. But the British, eager to dominate the region, saw this as a threat to their colonial ambitions. Tensions between the British and the Boers increased as British imperialists, led by Cecil Rhodes, sought control of the mines. Boer leaders, like Paul Kruger, resisted British interference. Thousands of British miners, Uitlanders, flocked to Transvaal but were denied political rights, leading to unrest. These mounting tensions set the stage for war. The discovery of gold and diamonds made South Africa one of the most valuable territories in the British Empire, but it also triggered one of the bloodiest conflicts in its history, the Anglo-Boer Wars. What happens next? As Britain and the Boers prepared for battle, South Africa stood on the brink of a devastating war. The stakes were gold, power, and control over the richest lands in Africa. Who would emerge victorious? The mighty British Empire or the determined Boer resistance? How did this war change the course of South African history forever? Stay tuned as we dive into the Anglo-Boer Wars and the brutal struggle for dominance in South Africa. The Anglo-Boer Wars. By the late 19th century, South Africa was a powder keg of colonial tensions. The British controlled the Cape and Natal, the Boers ruled the Transvaal and Orange Free State, and gold and diamond discoveries had turned the region into one of the most contested lands in the world. But the British and Boers were on a collision course. Two brutal wars would decide who would control South Africa. Wars that would see guerrilla warfare, scorched earth policies, and the first use of concentration camps in modern history. The First Anglo-Boer War, 1880-1881. The Boers strike back. First Anglo-Boer War, also called the Transvaal War of Independence, was a short but fierce conflict between the British Empire and the Boers of the South African Republic, Transvaal. What sparked the war? After the British annexed the Transvaal in 1877, many Afrikaners, Boers, felt betrayed. They had left the Cape during the Great Trek to avoid British rule, only for the British to take over their republic when it became valuable. In 1880, the Boers revolted, launching an armed rebellion against British control. Major battles and Boer tactics. Boers were expert marksmen, using superior knowledge of the land to ambush British troops. Battle of Majuba Hill, 1881. A decisive Boer victory. British forces suffered heavy losses. Boer victory. Embarrassed by their defeat, Britain signed the Pretoria Convention in 1881, granting Transvaal self-government under nominal British oversight. The Boers had defied the mighty British Empire, but peace would not last for long. The discovery of gold in Witwatersrand, 1886, reignited British ambitions, leading to an even bloodier war. The Second Anglo-Boer War, 1899-1902. Total war in South Africa, the Second Anglo-Boer War was one of the most brutal colonial wars in history. This time, Britain was determined to crush Boer independence once and for all. Why did war break out again? Gold and power. The British wanted full control over the gold-rich Boer republics. Uitlander disputes. British immigrants in Transvaal, Uitlanders, were denied political rights, fueling British anger. Cecil Rhodes' failed Jameson Raid, 1895. A botched British-backed coup attempt worsened tensions. Boer Ultimatum, 1899. The Boers demanded British troops leave the region. When Britain refused, war erupted. Phase 1. Boer Guerrilla Warfare, 1899-1900. The Boers shocked the world by launching a highly effective guerrilla campaign. Boer victories siege of Ladysmith, Mafeking, and Kimberley. The Boers trapped British forces for months. Battle of Colenso and Spion Kop, 1900. Devastating defeats for the British. The British, expecting an easy victory, underestimated the Boers. Using hit-and-run tactics, the Boers inflicted heavy casualties on the Empire. But Britain was not willing to lose. Phase 2. The British counterattack, 1900-1902. Realizing the Boers wouldn't be easily defeated, the British brought in hundreds of thousands of reinforcements. Lord Kitchener introduced brutal tactics, scorched earth policy. British forces burned Boer farms, homes, and crops, leaving families homeless. Concentration camps, tens of thousands of Boer civilians, mostly women and children, were placed in camps under terrible conditions. The concentration camps, a dark chapter. The British set up concentration camps to weaken Boer resistance, but these quickly became death camps. Over 26,000 Boer women and children died due to disease, malnutrition, and poor conditions. Thousands of Black South Africans were also placed in camps, suffering similar horrors. The international community condemned Britain's brutality, but the Empire was determined to crush the Boer resistance. The Fall of the Boer Republics and British Victory, 1902. By 1902, after years of brutal war, the Boers could fight no longer. Outnumbered, starving, and devastated by war, they signed the Treaty of Vereeniging, officially surrendering to Britain. The Boer republics became part of the British Empire. The British promised limited self-rule to Afrikaners. The seeds of apartheid were sown, as Britain and Afrikaners later cooperated to control the black majority. The aftermath, the road to union and racial segregation. Though Britain won, the war deepened divisions in South Africa. The Boers, despite their defeat, maintained political influence, leading to the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. But Black South Africans were left out of this new nation's power structure, setting the stage for decades of racial discrimination. What's next? The rise of racial segregation and apartheid with South Africa under British rule, a new system of oppression would emerge. How did British and Boer leaders lay the groundwork for apartheid? How did racial segregation become law in South Africa? Stay tuned for the next chapter as we explore the rise of apartheid and the struggle for freedom. Chapter 6. The Union of South Africa, 1910-1948. By 1910, South Africa had emerged from decades of war and colonial rule. But rather than a fresh start, this new chapter in its history would lay the groundwork for systematic racial segregation and oppression. The creation of the Union of South Africa brought together British and Afrikaner interests, but it came at a terrible cost to the black majority, who were increasingly pushed to the margins of society. 10. The birth of the Union of South Africa in 1902, the British officially defeated the Boers in the Second Anglo-Boer War, gaining full control of the region. But rather than ruling South Africa as a simple colony, Britain sought to unify the four territories, Cape Colony, Natal, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, into a single nation. 1910. The Union of South Africa is officially formed under British dominion. Louis Botha, a former Boer general, becomes the first prime minister. South Africa is granted self-rule, but only for whites. Black South Africans, despite being the majority, were excluded from political power. Legalizing racial segregation, the roots of apartheid. Almost immediately, the new government began passing laws that stripped Black South Africans of land, rights, and freedoms. Key laws of early segregation, 1913. Natives Land Act. Blacks were restricted to just 7% of the land, despite making up over 70% of the population. The majority of fertile land was reserved for whites. Job reservation policies. High-paying and skilled jobs were reserved exclusively for white workers. Pass laws. Black South Africans were required to carry passbooks to move around the country, limiting their freedom. This system laid the foundations for apartheid, which would be fully implemented decades later. 12. The birth of resistance. Formation of the African National Congress, ANC. As oppression intensified, Black South Africans began to organize against racial injustice. 1912. The South African Native National Congress, later renamed the ANC, was formed. Leaders like John Dube, Sol Plaatje, and later Nelson Mandela emerged to fight for African rights. The ANC initially pursued peaceful negotiations with the government, hoping for reform. But the white government ignored their demands, setting the stage for a long struggle. World War I, 1914-1918. South Africa and the global conflict. When World War I broke out, South Africa, as part of the British Empire, joined the war effort. White South Africans fought in Europe and in Africa, particularly against Germany in Namibia. Over 80,000 Black South Africans served in non-combat roles, laborers, porters, and support staff. Despite their service, Black soldiers received no rights or recognition after the war. Instead, white nationalists gained more political power, pushing segregationist policies even further. The rise of Afrikaner nationalism and growing divisions after the war, tensions between British South Africans and Afrikaners, Boers, intensified. 1924. The National Party, led by Afrikaner nationalists, gained power and pushed for stricter racial segregation. The Great Depression, 1929-1939, worsened economic conditions, leading to growing resentment among poor Afrikaners. Many Afrikaners blamed Britain for their hardships, leading to a push for independence from the British Empire. The National Party promoted Afrikaner identity, language, and culture, preparing the way for apartheid policies in the coming decades. World War II, 1939-1945. A nation. Divided, when World War II erupted, South Africa once again fought alongside Britain. Over 340,000 South Africans served in the war, mostly white, but some Black and Indian soldiers joined in non-combat roles. Afrikaner nationalists, however, opposed the war. Some even sympathized with Nazi Germany due to shared racial ideologies. Black South Africans hoped their wartime contributions would lead to political rights, but they were once again ignored. After the war, many white South Africans feared the growing demands for equality, and the stage was set for the rise of apartheid, the road to apartheid, 1948 onward. As World War II ended, South Africa faced a critical turning point. Would the country embrace racial equality and reform, or would white leaders tighten their grip on power? In 1948, the National Party won the elections, and apartheid became official policy, institutionalizing decades of racial discrimination. What's next? The rise of apartheid and the fight for freedom. South Africa was now at a crossroads. Would it continue its oppressive racial policies, or would the struggle for justice finally succeed? How did apartheid take root, and what were its most brutal laws? How did the ANC shift from peaceful protests to armed resistance? How did the world respond to South Africa's racial policies? Stay tuned as we explore one of the darkest yet most transformative chapters in South Africa's history, the era of apartheid. Chapter 7. Apartheid and Racial Segregation, 1948-1990, 47 geese, 1 jagsaw. As the world was rebuilding from World War II, South Africa took a dark turn. Instead of embracing change, its government doubled down on racial oppression, creating one of the most notorious systems of legalized discrimination in modern history, apartheid. For over 4 decades, millions of Black South Africans suffered forced removals, brutal crackdowns, and extreme political oppression. But despite the horrors, resistance movements rose, and a global anti-apartheid campaign pressured the government. How did South Africa become a racial police state, and how did it eventually collapse? 1948. The birth of apartheid, South Africa. Becomes a racial dictatorship in 1948, the Afrikaner-dominated National Party won the elections on a platform of apartheid, an Afrikaans word meaning separateness. Apartheid became official state policy, legally dividing South Africans by race. Whites controlled the government, economy, and land, while Black South Africans were reduced to second-class citizens. All non-white South Africans were stripped of rights, land, and freedom. The harsh apartheid laws, a racial prison system to enforce apartheid. The government passed a series of oppressive laws that controlled every aspect of life for non-white citizens. Key apartheid laws: 1949-1950, Prohibition of Mixed Marriages and Immorality Act, banned interracial relationships. 1950, Population Registration Act, forced every South African to be classified by race: white, black, colored, or Indian. 1950, Group Areas Act, forced removals of non-whites from their homes into separate townships and homelands. 1952, Pass Laws. Black South Africans had to carry passbooks at all times, restricting movement. 1953, Bantu Education Act, created an inferior school system for Black South Africans designed to keep them in low-paying jobs. These laws turned South Africa into a racial police state where Black South Africans were arrested, humiliated, and brutally controlled daily. Resistance movements. The rise of anti-apartheid fighters. Despite the extreme oppression, Black South Africans fought back. Political organizations like the African National Congress, ANC, and the Pan-Africanist Congress, PASI, led protests, strikes, and civil disobedience. 1952, Defiance Campaign. The ANC led mass protests against apartheid laws. 1955, Freedom Charter, a vision for a democratic, non-racial South Africa. 1959, Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, was formed, pushing for a more radical approach to resistance. But the white regime responded with brutal force, leading to one of the darkest days in South African history. 60. The Sharpeville Massacre, a turning point. March 24, 1960, thousands of peaceful protesters gathered in Sharpeville to protest the pass laws. South African police opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing 69 people, including women and children. Over 180 were wounded, many shot in the back while fleeing. The massacre shocked the world and exposed the brutality of apartheid. The government declared a state of emergency, banned the ANC and PAC, and arrested thousands of activists. Opposition to apartheid moved underground, leading to the start of armed resistance. 64. Nelson Mandela, sentenced to life in prison after Sharpeville. The ANC abandoned peaceful resistance and formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, a militant wing that carried out sabotage campaigns against the government. 1962. Nelson Mandela was arrested for anti-apartheid activities. 1964. At the famous Rivonia trial, he was sentenced to life in prison for sabotage and conspiracy against the state. Mandela was sent to Robben Island, where he would spend the next 27 years behind bars. Despite his imprisonment, Mandela became the global symbol of resistance. The BCE international condemnation. The world turns against apartheid. By the 1970s and 1980s, apartheid was under global pressure. The United Nations, world leaders, and activists condemned apartheid and demanded action. 1973. The UN declared apartheid a crime against humanity. Economic sanctions. The US, UK, and Europe imposed trade restrictions and an arms embargo on South Africa. Cultural and sports boycotts. South Africa was banned from the Olympics and FIFA World Cup. But inside South Africa, the struggle continued, and things were about to explode. Like the Soweto Uprising, the youth fights back on. June 16, 1976. Thousands of black students in Soweto marched against apartheid education laws. Police opened fire, killing at least 176 students, some as young as 12 years old. The image of a dying 13-year-old boy, Hector Peterson, became a global symbol of apartheid's cruelty. Protests spread across the country, shaking the apartheid government. The world could no longer ignore the horrors of apartheid. The 1980s. Apartheid's last stand. The fall of apartheid and Nelson Mandela's release. For nearly 50 years, apartheid ruled South Africa with an iron fist. But by the 1980s, the system was crumbling. Inside South Africa, mass resistance and uprisings made the country nearly ungovernable. Outside, global pressure and economic sanctions were crippling the economy. The apartheid government had no choice. It had to change. But how did South Africa go from a brutal racial dictatorship to a modern democracy? And how did one man, Nelson Mandela, become the symbol of unity and freedom? The 1980s, apartheid's last stand, nationwide protests and labor strikes intensified. South Africa was on the brink of a civil war. The economy was in freefall due to global sanctions and boycotts. The government declared multiple states of emergency, but repression could no longer stop the tide of change. Even within the white government, divisions were growing. Some hardliners wanted more crackdowns, while others saw that apartheid was no longer sustainable. In 1989, South Africa's new president, F.W. de Klerk, made a historic decision. It was time to negotiate the end of apartheid. 90. Nelson Mandela's release, a moment that changed history. On February 11, 1990, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela walked free. Millions watched worldwide as Mandela stepped out of Victor Verster prison, raising his fist in victory. The man the government once called a terrorist was now the key to South Africa's future. But the road ahead was still dangerous. Violence between political factions threatened to derail peace. Over the next 4 years, intense negotiations took place between the government, the ANC, and other parties. South Africa was transitioning, but tensions were high, and the fear of a full-scale civil war loomed. 94. South Africa's first democratic elections, the birth of a new nation, on April 27, 1994, for the first time in history, all South Africans, black, white, Indian, and colored, could vote. Millions stood in long lines for hours, eager to cast their votes. The ANC won in a landslide, and Nelson Mandela was elected South Africa's first black president. On May 10, 1994, Mandela was inaugurated, delivering a speech of hope, reconciliation, and unity. Mandela's message: "We enter into a covenant that we shall build a society in which all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall without any fear in their hearts. A rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world." South Africa was reborn, but could it overcome its painful past? 996. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Confronting the past, rather than seeking revenge, Mandela and his government created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The TRC held public hearings where victims of apartheid violence could share their stories. Those who committed human rights abuses, police officers, government officials, and even anti-apartheid fighters could confess their crimes in exchange for amnesty. The world watched as victims forgave their oppressors, and South Africa took a unique path to healing. While not perfect, the TRC helped South Africa avoid civil war and begin rebuilding as a united nation. Chapter 9. Modern South Africa. With apartheid officially over, South Africa stepped into a new era of democracy, freedom, and global recognition. But the end of apartheid didn't mean the end of all struggles. South Africa still faced massive challenges, but also incredible progress. South Africa's achievements: a nation rising, a democratic powerhouse. South Africa became a leading democracy in Africa. Economic growth: the country's economy boomed in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Cultural and sporting triumphs: 1995, Rugby World Cup victory. Nelson Mandela famously wore a Springboks jersey, uniting black and white South Africans. 2010, FIFA World Cup. South Africa became the first African nation to host the World Cup, showcasing its new identity to the world. The challenges: inequality, corruption, and crime. Despite its successes, South Africa still struggles with major problems: economic inequality. While a black middle class has emerged, millions remain in poverty. High unemployment. Many young South Africans struggle to find jobs. Corruption. Some leaders after Mandela faced major corruption scandals, damaging trust in the government. Crime and violence. South Africa has one of the highest crime rates in the world, a legacy of poverty and apartheid-era divisions. Yet, despite these issues, South Africa remains resilient, continuing to fight for a brighter future. Conclusion. The unbreakable spirit of South Africa. South Africa's history is a story of resilience, struggle, and triumph, a journey shaped by ancient civilizations, colonization, wars, apartheid, and liberation. From the San and Khoisan tribes to the rise of the Zulu Kingdom. From European conquests to the tragic era of apartheid, from Nelson Mandela's release to the birth of a democratic nation, South Africa has defied the odds time and time again. Despite its challenges, South Africa continues to evolve, a country rich in culture, history, and strength. Its story isn't just one of pain and division, but also of hope, unity, and perseverance. What's next for South Africa? The road ahead is not without challenges. Economic inequality, corruption, and crime remain pressing issues. But at the same time, South Africa thrives on its diversity, standing as a beacon of democracy and resilience on the African continent. What do you think South Africa's future will look like? Will it continue its rise as a global leader? Or will it face new struggles in the coming decades? Let us know in the comments below. Want to learn more? Keep exploring. This documentary only scratches the surface. There is so much more to discover about South Africa's history, culture, and people. Recommended topics for further exploration: the untold stories of African kingdoms, the anti-apartheid. Resistance, beyond Nelson Mandela. The Great Trek and the formation of Afrikaner identity. Don't miss out. Subscribe for more History Revealed. If you love deep dives into history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to History Revealed. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Share this video with friends who love history. Thank you for watching, and stay curious. History is always revealing new stories.